Hello. Welcome back for another book reading stream of The Book of Heroes by Miyuki Miyabi. We'll be starting chapter 8. Last stream we did chapter 6 and 7, where Yuri came back to the human realm, and the books told her that she needed a new name because she was now the all cast. So the name that she was given, well, that she decided upon was Yuri. So if you hear me say Yuri instead of Yuri, it's not that I'm mispronouncing it, it's that is her other name. Um, the Red Book, uh, his name escapes me right now, uh, got turned into a mouse that rides with Yuri. And then we also have the nameless devout. He was given a name, it escapes me right now. Um, and Yuri lived one day as her normal self, uh, where she took a shower, a bath, and got to say hi to her mom and stuff before switching places again with her double. Um, and then she took on the appearance of a uh, detective author to do research into her brother's case. And with the spell that lets her take on the appearance of people, she also takes on their knowledge. So she knows stuff that adults would know. Um, she also has the vestments that the nameless devouts gave her in the nameless land let her go invisible, and she got nowhere at the police department. They were basically like, "Well, we can't talk to you about this." And then she went to a local library and found out that someone, presumably her brother, under the power of the Yellow King, burned a book. Not any book in particular, just a book to see if he could do it, basically. Um, and also, the red book is now marked with the sign of the Yellow King. Uh, so other books don't like being near him because they're afraid that they will also get the mark of the Yellow King if he is near. Um, because of how close the red book was to the Yellow King's book, the hero's book. Uh, in recaps, I'll tend to call it the Yellow King because that's what sticks in my mind. But it's the hero, or they call it the Yellow King. Um, and then as they were, don't remember as they were leaving the police department, and that they had gone to the library first. That might have been it. Um, they heard the screams of books from the school, and they went over there, and a woman was about to jump out a window and they stopped her. Turns out she was unsure if it was a love interest or if she just was interested in Yuri's brother. But it was a woman who, I say woman, it was a student, same age as Yuri's brother, who was horribly disfigured as a child because she fell on a rake, I believe, and it scarred her face. Um, and everyone made fun of her, and then Yuri's brother, uh, uh, stood up for her which then caused a huge kerfuffle at the school because he did it in front of the class. He stood up in the class and name and shamed everyone. And then the next year, they were no longer in the same class, and Yuri's brother spent a class with a teacher that was upset with Yuri's brother for having done such a thing and encouraged the students to bully him. So he was getting heavily bullied. And so he actually was, to Yuri's surprise, Yuriko's, getting bullied and did have a reason to lash out on people. And he basically had warned this girl, I forget her name, that he was going to do something the day that he stabbed the two boys. But that he also told her he would come back for her at the library. And so she had been going every single day in between classes because she left the school because of how bad the bullying had got. And she would come in between classes to see if he came for her. And yeah, that's pretty much what happened the last two chapters. So this is chapter 8, The Man of Ash. Yuri braced herself. The glyph on her forehead shone like a star. Oh, do need to also bring up the fact that it seemed like they were going to get attacked at the very end of the last chapter in the school. So that's right where we're picking up, is right when she's getting attacked. Yuri braced herself. The glyph on her forehead shone like a star, illuminating the darkness in front of her. At once, the wall lost its solid appearance and recoiled like a living thing. This did much for Yuri's courage. She steadied her feet, took a deep breath, and shouted at the thing. "What do you want from me?" The darkness surged forward, filling the entire space of the corridor. Yuri strained her eyes until she saw something moving inside the darkness. It was undulating, throbbing. It heaved and shrank, as though its entire mass were drawing breath. Yuri raised her voice again. "What are you? If you have a name, I would hear it." When the thing responded, she heard its voice not with her ears, but with another organ. It seemed to speak directly to her heart. "I am an envoy of the King in Yellow." Michiru, that's the girl that was Yuriko's brother's friend. Michiru grabbed Yuri's sleeve from behind. I wonder if she heard it too. Atop Yuri's shoulder, Aju's whiskers trembled, tickling her cheek. Sky still stood behind her, arms spread wide. Okay, Aju, the red book, Sky being the nameless devout, who has to have a name in the human world. "You are the All-Cast?" Yuri glared back at the darkness. "Don't make me laugh," the voice continued. "Why must it always be children who know not even the true value of the mark upon their heads who seek to bring balance to the circle?" The darkness was quivering. It's laughing at me. It began to undulate faster now. Something circular was spinning in the very center of its mass, like a giant beach ball. No, larger than that. Yuri's eyes were glued to the thing. "Lady Yuri," Sky said, "do not let it draw you in." Yuri took a quick breath and vigorously shook her head. She peered sidelong at Sky to protect herself. The writhing darkness was not reflected in his deep purple eyes. If you are an envoy, you have come on some errand," Sky called out. "You are indeed before the All-Cast, creature of the King in Yellow. Why have you come? Why has your king sent you?" The spinning in the center of the darkness stopped. Or has the king tired of its freedom already and wishes to return to the Hall of All Books? Then the thing roared at them with a sound like the rumbling of thunder, and the circular shape in the center opened. An eye. It was a giant eyeball. Where it should have been white, it glowed a dull gold, and the pupil was narrow and pointed like a cat's. It glared at Sky. You are nothing but a crude figure, shaped of the dust of this circle. Yet you dare call upon my master? A huge vibration issued forth from the giant eyeball. The very air shook. A wave of force hit the party, and Yuri staggered. Behind her, Michiru was thrown back through the air. She collided with the library door and crumpled to the floor. Then the darkness disappeared, swallowed by the golden eyeball that now hung suspended in the air. In the space of a breath, the eyeball receded to the back of the corridor, from where it released another wave of energy. Yuri lowered her head and braced herself, dropping to one knee as the wave hit. Behind her, Sky still stood with his arms wide open. Lady Yuri, you must escape into the library and take the Lady Michiru with you. Yuri looked down the hallway to see something else emerging from the eye, a swarm of tentacles. The tips of the tentacles gleamed like jet black spears as they cut through the air straight toward Sky. Look out! Yuri threw herself at Sky a moment too late. The tentacles whipped around him in an instant and lifted him off the ground. Sky struggled in their grip, his shaven head only inches below the fluorescent lights of the ceiling. The tentacles retracted at the same time that the golden eyeball came barreling down the hallway towards Yuri. The tentacles constricted, then loosened, wrapping around him, then unraveling. The eyeball came so close to him, he thought they might touch. Then Yuri noticed the golden eyeball was coated in some milky white mucus-like substance. It came dripping down to splatter on the floor next to Yuri's hand, where she lay. There was a sizzling sound. The floor melted beneath the drops, leaving holes in the tiles. Yuri's eyes went wide. Acid. She jerked back her hand and shot to her feet. Another drop of the mucus fell right where her head had been only seconds before. Above her, the tentacles had completely wrapped around Sky. By now she could only see his head and the tips of his fingers. Ah, came a startled sound from the eyeball. You are a very interesting little dust puppet, aren't you? Groaning with pain, Sky struggled to turn away from the eyeball's gaze. The tentacles lifted him up and lowered him down, bringing his face closer to the eyeball. It blinked, causing a thick flow of mucus to drip onto the tops of the tentacles. The eyeball was examining Sky, with all the interest of a boy looking at a freshly captured bug through a magnifying glass. You are the gate? It shouted, its voice high with excitement. I've misread that tone a little bit. Aju chirped, jumping from the top of Yuri's head. He managed to reach one of the tentacles with his forepaws, began to climb up it at an incredible speed, biting with sharp teeth as he went. Let go of him, you big eyeball freak. You don't even have a proper arm and legs, he shouted. Though completely dwarfed by the size of the eyeball, Aju made good progress at first. He reached the spot where Sky's head emerged from the writhing mass, but then another tentacle whipped around from behind the eyeball, casually batted the mouse off into the air. Aju fell like a stone. Aju! Sky! Yuri didn't even have time to stand. She felt like her heart would beat right out of her chest. Her mind was blank. What do I do? What can I do? How can I even begin to fight this thing? She could only gasp for breath. What did the other Allcast do? Suddenly, Yuri heard a whistling noise in her ears. Another tentacle. Where is this one coming from? She tensed, ready to move. Something small flew in through one of the windows, moving faster than her eye could follow. Severed several of the tentacles. The eyeball howled with rage, flattening out sideways as though it was squinting against the pain. The next attack came directly after the first. This time, Yuri saw it happen. It flew in an arc through the window. A boomerang. The steel boomerang flew clear around the golden eyeball, slicing off the tentacles it happened upon along its orbit. The ones clutching Sky loosened. The The devout kicked hard at the eyeball, then plummeted headfirst toward the ground. Who's there? The eyeball sputtered in her mind. It drifted up toward the ceiling, shedding tentacle after tentacle. The severed ends writhed on the floor, steaming in pools of their own acidic blood. Yuri saw a black-gloved hand grip the window frame. Then the owner of the hand swooped in, like a giant raven alighting in the hallway. Yuri lunged toward the unconscious guy, picked him up in her arms, and turned to face the raven. She found herself looking up at him. He was a man, in fact, not a bird, but his countenance was bizarre. She had thought him old for a moment on account of his long white hair, so long he reached the middle of his back, bound in a long braid. It was as though a bucket of ash had been poured on his head. The jet-black robes that swirled around him were also covered with ash. No, dust. A thick collar protected his neck, and there were additional pads on his shoulders. His cloak, ripped and torn in places, was long enough to sweep along the floor. The man walked forward, taking long strides, his thick-soled boots making a metallic clang. He walked forward and casually stomped on the still writhing tentacles in front of Yuri before kicking them off to the side. The floor sagged ominously around the puddles of acid left by the eyeball. His black-gloved hands moved quickly, replacing the steel boomerang that came arcing back to him inside the fold of his cloak. When his hands next emerged, they held blades, a pair of swords. Their hilts were wrought silver, and the blades themselves shone with a translucent light, like glass. They were each longer than Yuri's forearm. The man held the swords up to either side of his face, and let them fall to the side, lowering his shoulders. He turned to the giant eyeball. Not someone so important that I feel the need to announce myself, he said in a calm, deep voice. It was different than any grown-up's voice Yuri had heard before. In that respect, we are the same, underling. He addressed the eyeball, a teasing tone in his voice. The eyeball howled with rage. The sound was like the grinding of gears in some half-broken machine, the sound to curdle souls. You dare mock an envoy of the king? Then Yuri saw a line from across the center of the eye. She thought for a moment that the eye was rotating in mid-air. Then the line opened and spread, creating a huge gash of a mouth, one bearing countless sharp fangs. Yuri screamed. The nightmarish mouth bore down on her. But the man leapt into action, every move as graceful as a dancer's, dual blades slashing through the air. The first cut set the eyeball spinning. The second slashed into its backside, sending it howling off a wall and back up to the ceiling. Yuri looked up, felt tiny fragments of something dusting her forehead and cheeks. The fangs. The severed fangs are raining down on me. The giant mouth closed once, and the whole thing trembled. Then it began to rain fangs like countless arrows. The man dodged the blast, his cape swirling behind him. His feet shifted beneath him, and he deftly changed direction, taking another stab at the envoy. The giant mouth dodged to one side at the last minute, but the inertia sent it spinning down the hallway, its maw hanging half open. The man chased it, but it had been a ruse. The eyeball lurched around. A bright red tongue emerged from between the fangs and whipped itself around the man's right wrist. Without a moment's hesitation, the man slashed it in half with the sword in his left hand. The black blood sprayed out of the wound, leaving the floor slick beneath it. With a murky, gurgling scream, like 100 drunks voiding the contents of their stomachs at once, the massive sphere of fangs and flesh began to spin rapidly. It shot up, ricocheting off the ceiling. The walls, the floor, the windows, everything smelled of the creature's blood. The stench was unbearable. Make that 1,000 drunks. Envoy whirled and slammed into the walls, spraying fluids and gradually growing smaller and smaller. Yer! The great mouth snapped shut. The creature was an eyeball once again. It stopped in a corner of the ceiling and blinked. The white of the eye was now blood red. The man in the cape bounded lightly over to Yuri. With his teeth, he pulled the glove off his right hand, swung it around to Yuri, swung it toward Yuri. Before she knew it, his hand was on her forehead. He released her almost immediately, turned back to the bright red eyeball, his hand up, the same hand that had touched Yuri's face, raised. A single band of light erupted from the man's hand, striking the giant eyeball dead center. Eyeball screamed, then dropped down to the floor, like a fly hit by a blast of insecticide. It morphed back into a nasty lump of toothy flesh on the way down, shooting out its fangs in a last desperate attempt. Yuri hardly saw the man move at all. His swords were a blur, and his cape swished, knocking every last fang out of the air. One smooth motion, he ran over to the fallen eyeball, knelt, and thrust his swords into it. This time, the envoy didn't even scream. It was just a faint hissing sound, like the air escaping a punctured tire. "Hey, Carp, I'll do my best." And then it was quiet. The giant eyeball creature slowly collapsed, like a time-lapse movie of a sandcastle eroding in the rain. Soon there was nothing but black dust on the floor where it had been. Then there was nothing, leaving the man kneeling there, with his swords in the shape of a V, stabbing the empty hallway. The man withdrew his swords and stood. He turned, his black cloak billowing. Yuri was sitting where she had fallen on the floor, hugging the still unconscious sky. Behind him, Michiru lay flat on by the library doors. The man turned to look down at Yuri. Their eyes met, and Yuri unconsciously flinched. The man looked much younger from the front. He was in his mid-30s, his early 40s at most. He had a long face with a dramatically pointed nose and chin, and his features were carved from wood. As if his features were carved from wood. Sorry, I'm having trouble reading today. His brows were bushy over his eyes, black hair streaked with white. His eyes were black, and his lids were half closed, almost like he was sleepy. One of his ears had been pierced, and a silver chain hung from it down to his jaw. Everything beneath his cloak was black too. His shirt with the raised collar was black. On top of that, he wore something like a vest, made out of several overlapping layers of black leather. He wore a thick belt wrapped twice around his waist, and loose-fitting black pants beneath that, with ragged holes in them where something had burned through. Yuri noticed that his boots had straps at the top that wrapped tightly around his legs, like the sandals she had seen in history books. He was still holding his swords. When Yuri's eyes went to them, he seemed to notice, and spinning them around once, he sheathed them into two scabbards at his belt. Yuri took a deep breath. Something was creeping up her back. She jumped, picturing a tentacle snaking out of the floor. It was Aju. "You okay, Yuri?" Aju looked slightly flattened, like he had been thrown down one too many times. But otherwise, he was none the worse for wear. She nodded, and he breathed a sigh of relief, stopping short when he noticed the man in black. Who's that?" The man smiled with half of his mouth. His skin was brown and it had the look of tanned leather. "I'm afraid I have not yet introduced myself." He lifted his thick-soled boots and took 2 strides toward them. Yuri shrank back, though she hadn't intended to. Eyes were transfixed by the man's angular, chiseled face. He knelt on one knee before her and extended the index finger of his right hand, pointing it squarely at Yuri's forehead. "You saw how I used it just now on the envoy?" He's talking about the glyph. "I'm guessing you're new at this, Lady Allcast," he added, smiling again with half his mouth. "Are you injured?" His voice was surprisingly gentle. "I don't think so," she replied, though she wasn't so sure about Sky. "And this nameless devout and rat are with you?" The man peered at Audrey and frowned. "You're a dictionary, aren't you? If you're going to transform into something, why not pick something a little more useful?" Audrey's whiskers trembled. How rude. I'll have you know that Yuri gave me this form. I see. How like a girl. The man sighed, and Yuri thought she heard him mutter, Why'd it have to be a girl? Yuri's mouth curled into a frown. Apparently he didn't think she was good enough. There's something wrong with being a girl? The man ignored her question. I think it's past time you revived your servant there. Yuri blinked, suddenly embarrassed. How do I do that? The man placed his bare right hand on his forehead. When Yuri didn't react, he sighed, took her right hand and put it on her forehead for her. Like I just did. The power of the glyph goes into her hand, see? He's right. A faint circle was glowing on her palm, the exact same pattern as her glyph. Now place it on your servant's forehead. Yuri did so, and Sky moaned softly. He opened his eyes. A second later, he jumped to his feet, almost butting heads with Yuri on the way up. Lady Yuri! Lady Yuri! Are you all right? It's true I did not play Fortnite with you. I got home like 30 minutes before stream. Seeing him pop up like a jack-in-the-box made Yuri smile despite herself. I'm fine, Sky. Yuri then turned to do the same to Michiru, but the man in the black grabbed her wrist. The girl is not your servant, is she? No, but... Then let her sleep a while, till we are through talking, at least. We have much to discuss. The man's eyes went to the door. I sense books. That's a library? Yes. Excellent. That should provide a perfect place for us. Without waiting for Yuri to respond, the man scooped Michiru into her arms, cradling her gently. Yuri stood and opened the door. Once they were inside the library, the man in black laid Michiru down on the book checkout counter. What if someone comes? There's no danger of that. The field formed when the creature arrived still stands. The people in this region will not be able to see us or hear us. Now that he mentions it, Yuri knows that no one had come out of the classrooms to see what was going on, even with all the ruckus. The man walked toward the back of the library. Around him, the books began to whisper to one another. A wolf! A wolf has come! The man paid them no attention. Grabbing the back of a nearby chair, he carried it over to Yuri. Have a seat, Lady Allcast. Yuri remained standing. You're a wolf? The man put a hand to his waist and bowed slightly. Allcast, the leader of the books in the library, that female from before, called to Yuri in a trembling voice, though she seemed more excited than fearful. He is a wolf, a famous one. They call him the Man of Ash. The man in black smiled faintly and turned to address the books. You know much for children. You may be young, yet we still possess knowledge, the female voice responded. Yes, your network of friends is quite valuable. Didn't you know who he was? Yuri whispered to Aju on her shoulder. But before he could respond, the man in black turned to her. Books that have few dealings with people know little of this world, Lady Allcast. Your dictionary companion there spent a long time stored away somewhere, I would imagine. Aju bristled at that. How rude, he squeaked, but very quietly. Not to mention he bears the yellow sign, though it's rather faded. You could tell that just by looking at him? The majority of books lose themselves when exposed to the power of the King in Yellow. They forget who they are. Perhaps that's why your wee one knows so little. He has lost both wisdom and knowledge to the king. Aju didn't even squeak this time. Crawled up to the nape of Yuri's neck where he curled into a tiny ball. Don't be too hard on yourself, little one. You'll remember everything in due time, the man said. His tone was more explanatory than consoling. Yuri petted Aju with the tip of one finger. Then the man in black, the Man of Ash, straddled a chair and sat. Yuri stayed standing. Sky walked up shakily, leaning on the back of her chair, then hurriedly stood back when he saw that Yuri wasn't sitting. It's okay, Sky. You should rest. The The devout's eyes were still slightly unfocused. Yuri took him by the hand and pushed down on his shoulders, forcing him to sit. Don't laugh at us, she said with a sidelong glance at the man of ash. We're new to this, like you said. The man of ash didn't even smile. I'm not concerned, and neither should you be. It is this way for all castes in the beginning. Yuri felt herself relax slightly. The man looked frightening. It seemed he wasn't as darkly cynical as he appeared at first. Thank you for saving us. You're welcome. How did you come here? How did you know we were here? I mean, the wolves have a nose for this sort of thing, Allcast. If we didn't, we'd be out of a job. Yuri took a long look at the man. He lifted a half-shut eyelid. Not good enough for you? No. The man of ash sighed deeply and looked away. It was a while before he returned his gaze to Yuri. I have been chasing the Book of Elam since it first appeared in this region. Yuri closed her lip tightly and nodded. Yet, I was unable to find and claim it before the last vessel was filled. I was too late. The man did next was entirely unexpected. He apologized. Because of my failure, there were casualties. I'm sorry. The vessel. My brother is the last vessel. Aju tickled Yuri's neck to console her as she spoke. The man raised an eyebrow. Your brother? Odd. I thought for sure it was one of your parents. Why is that? Because, Lady Allcast, only those who are related by blood to the vessel may receive the glyph, and only children. My name is Yuri, Yuri said then, as coolly as she could muster. Do not call me Allcast till I am worthy of the title. In fact, don't even call me Lady. Just Yuri is fine. The books around them began to whisper to one another again, so Yuri turned to them and apologized. Now that the fright of her encounter with the envoy had passed, she found herself blushing with shame. She had put everyone there in danger, and been entirely unable to help. She had panicked like a little child. She was upset that the man Ash told her not to worry about it. Very well, the man replied, staring at her. Will you tell me your name? I'm guessing that Man of Ash isn't the one you were born with. You can call me whatever you like. Ashhead. Aju suggested, cutting in. That's hard to say, Yuri said with a chuckle. Are you named that because of your hair? The man gave his long braid a shake. Quite so. Yuri thought a moment, then said, I'll call you Ash, then. That was the name of the main character in the comic book she liked, and as the Man of Ash looked so much like a comic book character himself, it fit. Aju wrinkled his nose. I don't know. That's not all that different from what you call me. Well, you'll just have to deal with it. Don't worry. There's no danger in me mixing up the two of you. And, she looked at Ash, this is my servant, Sky. Sky was rubbing his head, a pained expression on his face. He was about to bow, but Ash shook his head, cutting him off. I know who you are, nameless devout. You need not introduce yourself. I would hear what has happened before you met me. Have you found anything out about your brother, Yuri? Yuri explained everything as best as she could. Aju, done moping for the time being, pitched in now and then with additional information to round out the story. Ash listened, his eyes half closed the entire time. It made Yuri uneasy. It was hard to tell what he was thinking, and Yuri risked losing the thread of her own story several times. Aju hadn't been there to help. She was sure she never would have made it through the whole thing. Finally, she got up to where they had met Michiru in that very library, and when she was finished, she felt like a student at a music recital, waiting for the teacher to give her a grade. Ash stroked his pointed chin with his fingers, and his half-lidded eyes slowly turned to Yuri. Best not to give that girl Michiru a false sense of hope. There's no guarantee that we can bring Hiroki back. Yuri felt her hackles rise. What do you mean we can't bring him back? Maybe not in the way that Michiru hopes, at least. He has become the vessel, after all. It sounded like he was declaring that Hiroki Murasaki would never again return to his old life. Yuri swallowed the cold fear she had felt rising in her throat. So we can't even find him? That I do not know. It's mostly up to you. How do you know that? Because I've been around, Ash turned to Sky. You there. His tone was cold and accusatory. Sky tensed. Why did you accompany Yuri? Yuri stepped between Ash and the devout. She felt like she had to protect her servant, though she wasn't sure why. Look, when the hero broke free of the prison, the hollow book was damaged. Yuri quickly began to explain all that had happened in the Dome of Convocation, mixing her own thoughts with what the archdevout had told her. Ash listened without blinking. It was less like he was actually listening, more like he was simply letting Yuri explain herself into exhaustion. When she paused, he looked again at Sky. I asked you, not her, he said. Want to know what you think. Yuri glanced sidelong at Sky. He looked confused, and began to speak. He did so shakily. I am a nameless devout. I waited in the nameless land for Lady Yuri to arrive. I wanted to see the world beyond. I wanted to join her. That is why I was cast from the nameless land. That's enough, Ash grunted, cutting him off. Yuri gritted her teeth. Just answering your question. Why do you have to be so mean to him? Be mean? To a nameless devout? Now there's an interesting concept, Ash pointed at Sky. He is nothing, you understand, and nothing else. Whatever you think he might feel or might think is all an illusion. Then why do you ask him what he thought? Merely wished to know what the illusion contained, Ash said. And he told me he was pretty much what I expected. Don't need to hear any more of this. Now Yuri was really getting angry. Take back what I thought before. His heart is as black as his robes. This guy's my servant. I'll have you treat him with the respect he deserves. Respect? Ash lifted an eyelid and leaned toward her, fixing her with his gaze. Did you just say respect? Very unusual. Yuri stammered, taken aback. But I'm an all-caste. That's something special? Is that what the sage and the nameless devout told you? Ash pointed his chiseled nose toward the ceiling of the library and laughed out loud. Newly forged, and you strut with the best of them. You don't even know what all... You didn't even... Sorry. You don't even know why all cats exist. Yuri recalled how the man had dispatched the eyeball creature in the hallway. How he had sighed when he saw her. Didn't mean to be prideful, Yuri said at last, restraining her desire to shout at him. Just don't think you should call it Sky nothing. Why not? Came Ash's immediate retort. Because he's standing right here. He's not nothing. Lady Yuri, Sky whispered, touching his finger to her arm. All right. I am indeed fashioned of nothing. You're just gonna let him call you that? Sky shrank away from her. Ash bent his thin legs and sat again, shaking his head. So quick to get all excited. This is why I don't like dealing with girls. Yuri's eyes blazed. There you go again. Learn to walk the walk if you choose to talk the talk, child, Ash advised her, raising one of his bushy, white-streaked eyebrows. Standing there with your pet and your servant, how very like a child you are. Unconsciously, Yuri took a step away from Sky. And as far as Sky is concerned, I believe you were far more frightened in the hallway than he was. I'm surprised you haven't given up chasing the hero yet and gone home. She thought he was teasing her. Then he pointed at her forehead. You should go to the sage who gave you that glyph. Have him take it off. We'll be free of all of this then. Yuri stepped back, ashamed of the fear she felt. But then you'd be in trouble without me. Not particularly. Not at all, really. It would just make my job a little bit more difficult. First, I'd have to find another all-caste. Yuri was as shocked as she would have been had he slapped her cheek. Another all-caste? She stammered. Another all-caste, yes. But did you think you were the only one in the entire circle? No wonder you thought you were so special. Technically speaking, there can be as many all-castes as there are vessels. More even, since there only need to be related to the vessels, and most people have more than one relative. Well, maybe we'll just find ourselves another wolf, Audrey squeaked, baring his teeth. There's lots of them around. We'll just find one who's nicer, and kinder, and more respectful of Yuri. Ash didn't seem concerned. You could, though I don't think that's your best option. Know why? The man touched a large hand to his chest. I know the Book of Elam inside and out. I don't know how many hairs are on my head, how many in my eyebrows, but I know that copy well. I know exactly what's written inside of it. I know the number of words, the number of lines. I know how many times a particular word appears in a particular chapter, and I know all the names it contains. I even know the words that appear in it only once. Were it not taboo, I could recite its contents entirely from memory for you here right now. I've recited them to myself many times. Thankfully, no one was nearby to hear. That's why you should join me. Either that, or you'll waste time wandering. The man stopped in the middle of his monologue. His mouth opened and snapped shut like a word had escaped unspoken. He lowered his eyes and slightly shook his head in the direction of the checkout desk where Michiru lay. The more time you waste, he said quietly, the more the sadness will spread around you. The more little worlds will end, one after another. He looked at Yuri, his voice gentle again. You don't like conflict, do you? Yuri was still thinking about what he had said, about little worlds ending. That's exactly right. Each of us lives in our own little world. In Michiru's, there was Hiroki Murasaki, who fought for her, saved her, but now he was gone. Michiru's world was crumbling apart. You, Sky joined in, speaking softly. He was looking at Ash. You have seen much sadness like this, haven't you? Ash did not respond. He seemed to be ignoring the devout, as though Sky weren't even in the room. In other words, Ash went on, lightly tapping the back of his chair, whether we like it or not, we must join forces. Well, I don't like it, Aju bristled. Let's find someone else, Yuri. I'm sure there are other wolves out there who know the Book of Elam as well as this one does. In her heart, Yuri could hear the sound of tiny worlds breaking, crumbling into countless fragments of sorrow. Wolf needs an all-caste, Ash said to her, ignoring the mouse, in order to defeat the king in yellow. I require that glyph on your forehead. Though a wolf might be able to thwart the king on occasion, I cannot bend it to my will, or return it to the hollow book, he chuckled. We have to work together. You might say we share a fate. Should the king in yellow defeat you, then I'm done for. Yuri looked up. You'd join me even though I'm just a girl? I'll take a chance. Yuri smiled. She knew better than to think Ash had decided to trust in her. All he wants is the power of the glyph. Yuri was just the glyph's means of transportation. But who cares? Yuri felt a kind of resolve growing inside her. Fine, she said. But mark my words. I'm going to make you glad you had a girl for your all-caste by the time we're through. Ash laughed out loud. A sore loser, I see. That's good. He stood. Let's be off. To where? Do you know where to go? Of course I do. Told you I knew the Book of Elam, didn't I? We are going to my region, which happens to be a place where the Book of Elam came from. Where is that? Another country? Europe, maybe? Ash had been walking toward the exit, but now he stopped and looked around her. Wait, you mean to say you don't even know the difference between the circle and a region? No, Ash rolled his eyes skyward. Look, it's simple. The circle is everything. Speak in terms you can understand. It's everything out to the ends of the universe. That's the circle. I know that. Well then, regions are worlds that exist within those boundaries. There are many. Countless number, in fact. This reality you live in is but one region, in Europe, but an area within that region, part of the same place. My region is something entirely different from this world. Then where is it? Well, I'm probably gonna butcher this. The Hatelands. Haetlands, he said. Those answer did her little good. To be precise, my region is called the Hatelands Chronicle. Yuri looked up at Aju, giving his sleek fur a pat. The little mouse's tail shivered. Well, I wasn't expecting that, he squeaked. Yuri, means he's a character in a book called the Hatelands Chronicle. He's not a human. He exists in a story, Yuri. Oh, great, we're with the Witcher. Yuri's eyes went wide. Something the sage had said about stories creating their own regions flashed across her mind. Every book is its own region. As the mouse says, I'm what you would call a fictional character. The weaver who wrote the Hatelands Chronicle created me. Yuri pointed at Ash. But you're not fictional. You're here right now, talking to me. Something wrong with that? Didn't the sage who gave you your glyph tell you anything? Weavers create stories, Sky breathed. Yes, the weaver that made me died a long time ago. Yet I still live. I'm immortal. At least until someone writes a sequel to the Hatelands Chronicles and kills me off. Or I am devoured by the King in Yellow. Sighed. Roughly half of all wolves are like me. The other half are human, such as yourself. Does much credit to the human wolves, really. Their lives, like those of most weavers, are limited, after all. Most weavers? Yuri echoed. You mean some weavers were created like you? Very good. I do believe you're catching on. Ah, because authors write stories with authors in them sometimes, right? Don't the characters they create end when the story ends? How can they do things that aren't in the story? Or become wolves like you, or weavers, making their own stories? Yuri felt herself growing confused even as she spoke. What makes you think they can't? Ash asked, turning to face her. I see. You think that weavers write only what they wish to write, and set down their pen, and that is all. But it's not. The region they have created is there, continues to exist. It lives, even if all within it are fictional. That's why, Ash said, a gleam in his eye. The weaving of stories is a frightening thing indeed. They are creating worlds, creating stories, creating history, creating lives. Even should their creator go away, the story remains. Though they return to the Nameless Land, that is. He paused. Actually, I said something wrong just now. We fictional characters are not immortal. Our region vanishes the moment that the story containing it is returned to the Great Wheels. He fixed his eyes on her. Yuri, from here on out until I say so. Till you say what? Till I say it. Do not ask me what something is. What it isn't. In fact, ask nothing at all. You waste our time. Yuri nodded glumly. Ash turned toward the exit. Field is collapsing. You'd best wake Michiru. And there's an actual break in the story. It's even got the little design to tell me to take a break. I'm gonna take a drink. Yuri spoke with Michiru alone. When Sky tried to join her, Ash violently pushed him away, ordering him to leave that to the womenfolk. Yuri didn't ask why, and she had only just now promised not to. Besides, Michiru couldn't see Sky anyway. Though she couldn't imagine what the problem was, she resisted the urge to protest. Yuri couldn't tell her that Murasaki wouldn't be coming home. She just said that they didn't know how long it would take. Michiru would have to keep herself well until then. She'd go home now, get some rest. The girl was in a daze. Ash had warned Yuri that though she could use the power of her glyph to bring humans back to consciousness and mend their wounds, they would suffer some memory loss as a result. It hadn't been a lie. When Michiru came to, she had trouble recollecting who Yuri was at first. I want you to try coming to school again. I'm sure your friends in class and the teachers won't let the teasing happen again. All right, Michiru said, though she sounded doubtful. And try to cheer up. Murasaki would be sad if he saw you like this. Michiru nodded again and left. Yuri stood in the library window, watched her walk out along the edge of the schoolyard, and out the front gate onto the street beyond. Ash announced that the envoy's field was down, and sure enough, when the bell rang again, the hall quickly filled with students. Yuri and the others walked through their midst, unheard and unseen, till they reached the middle of the schoolyard. Ash had insisted they come here. So these are the people Hiroki lived with. Ash squinted, looking up at the school building. Students poked their heads out the window, calling to friends in the yard below. Teacher in a short-sleeved shirt walked out of the building, heading for the gym. He held a clipboard with an attendance list on it over his head, for a bit of a shade from the warm sun. It's quiet, Aji said, sounding a bit irritated, and you think about what happened to Hiroki. The mouse's pink nose trembled with anger. They don't know anything about it. Even if they do, they're not taking responsibility or being properly punished. Ash said nothing. The nameless devout stood still, staring up at the blue skies. A shout went up from the school building, coming from a window on the second floor. Some of the boys were laughing and playing by the window. One stuck his arm out of the window. He was holding a notebook. Come and get it. Come on. He waved the notebook in the air outside the window, calling to someone in one of the classrooms. Not calling, teasing. The boys laughing around him were probably the bully's friends. Yuri heard someone egging him on. Drop it out the window. Drop it. Directly beneath the window was a small pond. Yuri heard another voice, a thin voice, crying for the notebook back. Lady Yuri, Sky whispered, walking over to her. He blinked. I agree with Aju. It makes me angry, too. Yuri had no way of knowing whether the boys up there had anything to do with what happened to Hiroki, but watching them still made her feel sick. The teacher was returning now from the gym. Didn't even look up at the shouting boys. Just calmly walked across the yard, back inside the school building. The boys hadn't noticed him either. Now Yuri caught a glimpse of a smaller boy, the owner of the notebook. His face was pale with fear. He tried to grab at the book, but someone pushed him. He fell back, out of sight. Wait for me, guys, Yuri said, running toward a strand of trees at the edge of the schoolyard. They were cherry trees, rather large ones at that. They were more than large enough to conceal Yuri. Yuri transformed, borrowing the shape of Officer Kashimura, the policewoman she had met at the station. She remembered the uniform, those round eyes of hers. The only thing she felt like she couldn't copy was the name badge on her chest. She didn't want word of this getting back to anyone at the station. In truth, Officer Kashimura had been a bit too motherly for Yuri's purposes. She would have preferred someone more frightening, but all she really needed right now was the uniform. It belatedly occurred to her that she could have gone for one of the policemen she had seen on patrol in the area. There's no time for that now. Yuri stepped out from behind the cherry trees and strode purposefully across the schoolyard. Looking up, she put her hands on her hips and scanned the second-story window. The boys were still at it, but they had replaced the notebook with the notebook's owner. Now it was the boy hanging half out the window. The color had drained from his face, and he was struggling to get back inside. Several arms pushed at him, keeping him hanging over the windowsill. The shouts of encouragement from the other boys were only growing louder. Yuri spotted a laughing face over the boy's shoulder. The boy had been holding the notebook hostage. He had the boy in the window by a shirt collar, busily peeling the boy's fingers off the edge of the window. Time to fly. Come on, you can do it. Hey, someone grab his legs. Yuri took a deep breath and shouted, "Stop that at once." All motion in the second-story window ceased. Several pairs of eyes turned to look down at the schoolyard, where Yuri stood in full policewoman regalia. A few new faces appeared at the window, looking out to see what was up. Uh-oh, it's a cop. Yuri wasn't sure who had spoken. Whoever it was, he didn't sound all that concerned. Yuri's anger went from a simmer to a full boil. Still in her uniform, she touched one hand to her concealed glyph. Then she thrust her hand toward the source of her rage. Every boy, except for the one hanging out the window, was instantly knocked back. A breath later, there came the sound of tables and chairs crashing together from inside the classroom, the girl screaming, "Teacher! Teacher!" Someone was crying. So now they call the teacher. Yuri clenched her hand into a fist. The boy clinging to the window was staring at her, his mouth wide open. Yuri undid the transformation. The policeman vanished. For a moment, Yuri thought that a cloud had passed over the sun, but she looked up to see Ash towering behind her. "Hardly actions befitting a lady all caste," he said, though there was a hint of mirth in his voice and a sparkle in his eyes as he looked up at the school building. Were they involved with Hiroki? I have no idea. Couldn't let them do that. The teacher had arrived on the scene. The boy clinging to the windowsill turned to look back toward the classroom. He flinched. The teacher was scolding him. Looks like he thinks it was all the boy's fault. What are you going to do now? Yuri didn't want to believe that the teacher could be so clueless. But there he was, roughly dragging the boy the others had been picking on away from the window. The man was shouting. Yuri gritted her teeth. I don't believe this. Time for round 2, Ash said quietly, drawing his right-hand sword. He spun in his hand, muttered something quickly, and pointed the sword tipped directly at the window. A wave of force shot through the air. Not just the boy's window. All the windows around it rattled loudly. The teacher, his hand on the boy's neck, was flung back out of sight, while the boy at the window was tossed backward into the classroom. Teachers were nervously looking out the windows, on all 3 floors now. Strange line of bobbing heads. Yuri watched them for a moment, then turned to Ash. Hardly actions befitting a wolf. Oh? I merely thought you'd like to see my mage blade in action. He had already sheathed his sword. The wolf smiled. It appears like you're making progress in understanding the use of your glyph. It's embarrassing, Yuri said. The people in my region aren't all like this, you know. Ash thrust his hand into his pockets and nodded. I know that quite well. I've been around, you know. There's evil everywhere. Sometimes big, sometimes small. Yuri heard a commotion from the school building. Now the fire alarm was ringing. To the Hate Lands, Ash said. Yuri turned away from the school and began to walk. That's the end of chapter 8. I am going to get some more of my drink, and we'll start on chapter 9. I honestly did not expect chapter 8 to be as short as it was. Granted, I probably could have seen it if I looked at the table of contents at the beginning. Yeah, let's start chapter 9, The Land of Fear and Loathing. Sorry, no, I'm on, like, wait, is that Las Vegas? Ash was able to jump from region to region at will. According to him, it was a skill every wolf possessed. It's basic glyph magic. No one can become a wolf without the ability to use it. Need be able to travel between regions for the chase, after all. But it only works for me. With their current numbers, they would have to travel a different way. It was decided they would first go to Minochi's cottage. From there, They could use the magic circle on the reading room floor to travel together wherever they liked. Yuri felt a slight dizziness during the teleportation. It always seemed to be the case when she was moving through Yuriko Murasaki's reality. Sky gripped her hand tightly. Ah, you have returned. Even before Yuri had found her footing on the reading room floor, the low voice of the sage welcomed them. The reading room was as dim, dusty, and quiet as always. Even though it was brimming with the presence of so many ancient books, there was a sense of calm to the place. Yuri noticed it all the more, having come directly from the noise and brightness of the outside world. Yuri was about to say something when Ash stepped outside the magic circle, looked up toward where the sage sat, and announced himself. It has been too long. I see it is you, the sage said to the wolf. Yes, the chase happens within my domain, you might say. Quite suddenly, the sage and Ash were engaged in a deep conversation, of which Yuri understood only fragments. Aju and Sky looked equally confused. The three of them stood staring, watching the wolf and the sage talk. They spoke rapidly, Ash occasionally nodding, occasionally shooting quick glances at Yuri and Sky. The wolf and the book were using so many unfamiliar words. Yuri felt completely out of her depth. On her shoulder, Achi squeaked irritably. Then Ash turned to Yuri, took a half step back, and bowed. With a nod, he indicated that she should speak. We went to my brother's school, she began, looking up at the sage. Yes, I have heard what happened. Must have been most difficult for you. The sage spoke gently, twinkling a soft deep green as he spoke. And you will next go to the Hatelands, whence comes the man of Ash? He continued. You have found a strong ally. You knew that Ash would find us, didn't you? We have known each other for quite some time, Ash interjected. He pointed at the magic circle beneath our feet. Yet it seems I'm not the only one here who has come. Observe, someone has touched up your glyph here. Indeed, the unskilled, erratic lines of the first circle that Yuri had drawn are bolder now, thicker, and more distinct upon the floor. Another wolf? Indubitably, yes. Wolves can draw magic circles too? With these. Who was it? He looked up at the sage. Vunt? Kernaki, actually, the sage said, a happy ring to his voice. Him I had not seen for an even longer time than you. He went right back after I told him you had already arrived, however. Said he'd leave things to you. He left a message saying that if we should require his services, he could be found hunting beastmen in the barren mountains of Dukashi. Or Dukashki. I don't know, that might be a CH, that's K. Dukashi. The old man's still doing well, it sounds like. Hardly older than yourself, the sage chuckled. Once again, Yuri and her companions were left out of the conversation. Incidentally, while he was here, he put up a void hedge around the cottage. That'll be a help, for you as well as us. Okay, what's all this then? Aju interjected, unable to contain himself any longer. Do you think you guys could talk in a way that we can understand? What the heck is this void hedgy thing? Sage and Green, Ash said, ignoring the mouse. Why did you choose such an unseasoned dictionary? Was this intentional? Perhaps it is better to say that it was not I, but the yellow sign that chose him. You of all people should understand this. Indeed, but the mark on him is already quite faded. Perhaps because of his proximity to Yuri's glyph? Ash turned to face Yuri. Will you not choose another dictionary to bring with you? Yuri shook her head so vigorously she could hear her hair swish through the air. Aju's coming with us. Thanks, Yuri, Aju squeaked in a tiny voice. Ash rolled his eyes and nodded. That's decided then. And incidentally, the void hedge is a device that works to conceal this cottage from the eyes of the people of the outside world. In addition, it will make it difficult for those who already know about the college, Yuri's relatives specifically, to recollect the cottage and its location. And what's this about hunting beastmen? Yuri asked. The unfamiliar word had piqued her interest. There is a book, Ash said, moving his hand as though he were flipping pages, that turns all who read it into beastmen. It's one of the copies. Kornacki has been chasing it now for over 5 years. Oh, was all Yuri could say to that. Do not worry. This copy is not in your region. Can the beastmen ever be returned to their original form? She asked. Ash fixed the devout with an icy stare. No. Nor will they ever regain their former intellect. Leave them to roam. And they attack other men and eat them. They're simple beasts, twisted creatures. The most charitable thing one can do is kill them. Guy's gaze dropped to the floor. It's horrible, Yuri said. The dark side of the hero's power worked in frightening ways. Then a thought crossed Yuri's mind, like a cold draft through the door. What if something like that has happened to Hiroki? Maybe he hasn't only been possessed. Maybe he's been altered in some irreversible way. Ash stepped into the center of the magic circle, his tattered cape billowing around him. If stories like that are enough to scare you, we are in trouble. The Hatelands is far more terrifying place than that. Yuri looked up at his face, and over at the green light of the sage. That's where the Book of Elam came from, isn't it? Indeed it is. Then I'll go. I'll go anywhere I have to. Sky nodded and moved over to stand by Yuri's side. Let us be off. The magic circle on the floor began to glow with a pale light. That's another break, which I actually kind of need right now. I'm gonna mute the microphone. My nose is funky. Okay, sorry about that. For some reason, when I read for a long time, my nose gets really stopped up. Wachoo! The instant Yuri arrived, before her feet even touched the ground, she sneezed loudly. It was cold. The kind of cold that went straight to your bones. What is this place? Am I on a mountaintop? In the middle of a glacier? No, this is inside. The floor beneath Yuri's feet was wooden. The walls were made out of some kind of hardened clay. Rafters hung low above her head. There was a window. Strips of ragged cloth hung from the warped frame. A haphazard attempt at a curtain, she surmised. The cloth was fluttering. That was where the cold wind was coming from. Something in the room was creaking rhythmically. Yuri looked down at her feet. There was a magic circle, a glyph. Here, too. This one was slightly smaller than the one in the reading room. It hadn't been drawn on the floor, physically carved into the wood with a knife of some sort. The wood floor was damaged in other areas as well. It seemed to be in a shack of some sort. There were signs of habitation. A bed stood against one wall, and next to it a crude wooden hanger for clothes. There was a table, a chair, and a desk. Here and there stood bookshelves, each stuffed with books, overflowing in fact. Books sat on the floor, on the chair, and stacked by the bed. Welcome to my humble abode, Ash said, as he stepped outside the magic circle with the ease of someone returning home. He took off his black cloak and threw it over the nearby chair. Then he removed his boots and tossed them onto the floor. Walking across the small room, he went to the window with the ragged cloth curtains, began tugging on something like a handle, trying to close it. Yuri gaped. She had never been in a home so cluttered, so rough, so bone-chillingly cold. The desk was covered in books and bound scrolls. A pen holder lay on its side at one edge. Several pens were scattered across the top. The front side of the desk was plastered with documents and scraps of paper, attached with pins so dense that the paper looked like strips of bark growing on the side of a stubby tree. Yuri spotted some bottles atop the table. There was also something like a chemistry set, complete with test tubes and some items that were unmistakably weapons. Swords, knives, and something like a bow. All of them seemed sturdy, their edges sharp. She stared at a larger roll of paper, maybe a map. Next to that stood a sphere and a holder. Is that a globe? Yuri stepped hesitantly toward the desk. On the other side of the room, Ash had finally managed to shut the window. The chill wind ceased, though it was still cold. I have to get that fixed one of these days, he grumbled, walking back to the table and throwing himself down in a chair. Before he sat, he kicked aside a pile of stuff, clearing a spot on the floor. Sit where you like. It seemed safest to sit directly on the floor, so that's what Yuri did. What's the deal with the cold here? Audrey screeched angrily from Yuri's collar. Don't you have a heater, or a fireplace, or a stove, or anything? I've got a fireplace, sure. I just don't know whether it's usable. Pointed over to where a brick mantelpiece poked out from behind a mound of books. Guy offered to take a look and gingerly walked over to examine it. That's a globe, right? Yuri asked again, pointing at the sphere on top of the table. Ash raised his hand and gave it a spin. Of this region, yes. That explained why none of the continents looked right from where she was sitting. Are the directions the same? I mean, is up still north? It is. Where are the Hatelands? Ash extended a long finger and stopped the slowly rotating globe. He spun it a bit to the right, then pointed at a spot near the top of the sphere. Here. We're as far north as you can go. Is it a big country? How large is it? Ash did not answer. He stared meaningfully at the spot where his finger touched the globe. You mean it's so small you can cover it with one finger? That's right. Creak, creak. Yuri heard the sound again. It seemed to be coming from somewhere above them, but she could feel vibrations in the floor beneath her at the same time. What's that sound? Ash pointed up. There's a windmill up there. This village uses windmills for power. There's no electricity here, in other words. Yuri noted a few lamps sitting here and there, and a few candle sconces hanging from the ceiling. It is a cold, poor, and small country. This village lies at its furthest northern reaches. The village's name was Kanal, or Canal, Kanal. Locals supported themselves by hunting and farming. Take a look at the window if you like. Yuri walked over to the window, startled to see her breath white before her face. She noticed tiny icicles hanging down from the edge of the window. Even though it was incredibly cold inside, the window was fogged with condensation. She wiped at it with one hand, discovered that it wasn't just condensation. The window was incredibly filthy. Ash wasn't a fan of house cleaning, apparently. It's snowing. Large flakes drifted down outside the window. It's still early winter, actually. Aju hopped up to the top of her head and stuck his nose to the glass. No sooner had he done so than he began to sneeze uncontrollably. Yuri noticed something else about the glass. Underneath the fog and the dirt, it wasn't all that transparent to begin with. Like a very old window. Maybe they don't have the technology to make good ones yet, she thought, realization dawning on her. The Hatelands weren't like Japan and America and Europe in the 21st century. This wasn't that kind of world. It was in a world of a long time ago. Yuri boosted herself up as high as she could and peered outside. Beyond the drifting flakes, she saw a world encased in glittering white ice. She spotted rooftops, angled sharply at the top, and several of them had small windmill towers extending even higher. The houses were made of wood and bricks. with wooden planks running between large rafters. Everything man-made was drab. Apparently there is no paint in this world. A few trees stood between the houses, but they were all bare. Ice sculptures with pointy branches. There was no grass, not even the strange, colorless grass she had seen in the Nameless Land, nor any flowers. A small path wound between the houses, muddy and half frozen. She heard a dog howling somewhere. At least they have dogs here. She had been beginning to wonder if anything lived here at all. There is much land around here that is too hard for hoeing, even in summer. At some point, Ash had walked up to stand beside her at the window. Still, there is a wheat field to the south of the village. Harvest time has long since come and gone. From now until winter's end, we hunt. The men would venture out into the frozen woods and mountains, hunting animals for meat and hides. Back in the village, the women would work the hides and flesh, first making clothing and food the village needed to survive, then selling the rest. There would be no green vegetables or fruit until spring, but roots and tubers had been stored in cellars. That would be their main sustenance through the winter. Most of the wheat is taken to pay taxes in any case. Bread's a luxury item here. For the most part, we eat potatoes. Is your stomach strong, Yuri? I think so, she said. I think I'll use magic to keep me full for the time being. The cold air leaking in through the window made her eyes water. There doesn't seem to be anyone outside. The women and children are all in their homes. It's still too early in the day for the men to come down from the mountains. You would have expected to see lights in the windows then, even though it seemed like noontime outside. The weather was so gloomy. Yuri would have wanted light. Lamp oil's probably a luxury item too. Pretty high up here, aren't we? Yuri couldn't look down very well, standing on her toes, but the clouds seemed close above them. Ash stepped behind her and lifted her up so she could see better. Toes found a beam sticking out of the wall to take some of her weight. My house stands on top of the hill of the dead. Yuri trembled. Why is it called that? The land around us is a graveyard. We'll see immediately if you care to walk outside. And why do you live here again? Because I'm close to the dead. There's... there. That's Flint, I think. Heard Audrey say from behind her. He must have jumped off her when Ash approached. Yuri looked around and saw that Sky had finished excavating the fireplace, stacked some logs inside, was now attempting to start a fire. Audrey was perched atop his head. Small tongue of flame licked up the side of the logs. Sky grinned. There we go. Firewood began to burn. Yuri saw the dancing flames reflected on Sky's bald scalp. There's an oven down those stairs, Ash said to Sky, indicating a corner of the room where wooden steps led down from the hole in the floor. Make a fire and boil us some water. Sure Yuri would like something warm to eat. Sky nodded and quickly headed down the stairs. His hard footfalls echoed as he left. I'll help, Yuri said, standing. Leave it to him. You sit. But Sky isn't some errand boy, Yuri protested. He's your servant, no? Ash asked without a trace of humor in his face. And besides, now's a good time for your precious whys. You'll regret it after if you don't take this opportunity to ask. I don't answer them later anyway. You don't seem to like Sky very much, do you, Ash? It's like you don't trust him. You merely understand that the Nameless Devout have a role to fulfill, and that is all. Yuri was silent. Ash began picking up the bottles sitting on the table one at a time, giving them a little shake to ascertain their contents. I think I'm going to see if we're really surrounded by a graveyard. Without waiting for the wolf's approval, Yuri ran down the stairs, Audrey clinging to the back of her collar. The ground floor was as cold and as derelict as the floor above. The ceiling was lower here, covered with wattled mud, making it feel like the burrow of some subterranean creature. Sky was busily preparing the oven. She assumed that this she, assu- she assumed this was the kitchen, since the oven was here. There's no sign of any food stores or spices. When Sky saw her, he smiled. There is tea, Lady Yuri, and the water in the kettle is fresh. Believe Master Ash has someone to look after his place while he's absent. Too bad he doesn't have them clean the place up while they're at it. Yuri announced she was going to take a look outside, and she headed for what appeared to be the exit. It was a rough door, made of logs bound together with iron. She found it surprisingly heavy. Pushed, managed to open it several inches, and the snow came swirling in. Her face froze in the cold wind. Yuri squinted against the blast, pulled up the hood of her vestments of protection, stepped outside into a world of whites and grays, the color of frozen ground. Few steps led down from the shack, with a railing on one side. She walked down carefully, holding tightly onto the railing to keep from slipping. Her black robes were soon white from the snow that seemed to fall ever harder. Ash had been telling the truth. The shack stood at the very top of a gently sloping hill, covered in every direction by evenly spaced gravestones. The graves were simple, rectangular stones jutting up from the ground with no or adornments, and too numerous for her to count. There were slight differences in coloration between the stones, which she attributed to differences in age and exposure to elements. Yuri exhaled a long white stream of breath. Wow. Yeah, Audrey said from beneath her collar. I've never seen this many graves in one place. It was like the graves had wandered here from some other place to gather round Ash's hut. That's gotta be the whole village under those stones, Audrey said. He meant it as a joke. Somehow it didn't come out sounding like one. I mean, this town ain't that big. There's gotta be more graves than residents. Yuri walked between the stones, careful not to step too close to any. Her feet trod the frozen ground, occasionally crushing frozen chunks of snow. The gravestones really did look like they had gathered there. She wasn't imagining things. All the stones, carved with letters she couldn't read, were facing toward the shack at the top of the hill, looking up at the second-story window where Ash made his home. Yuri looked down toward the bottom of the hill, where a large fence of stone and iron circled the entire graveyard, enclosing the hill in two-story shack with its creaking windmill at the summit. There was only one gap in the fence with a gate of solid-looking iron. The gate was leaning off its hinges, as though they were not strong enough to support its weight. The side that opened had been wrapped with a chain, from which hung a sturdy padlock. To Yuri, it seemed less like Ash was taking care to lock the door, and more like someone on the outside wanted to keep him and whoever was under those gravestones from getting out. Yuri went back up the steps to the shack, brushing off the snow before she entered. The fire was burning in the oven. She turned as she walked in. Sky turned as she walked in. I think I'm getting used to the cold, Yuri said, smiling at him. Probably thanks to these vestments. I would think so, the devout said. He sounded concerned. Just a moment, I'll bring you some tea. Yuri went up the stairs. Ash was sitting with his legs up on the table, slouching against the back of his chair. Satisfied. She walked into the middle of the room and sat down, opening her vestments and hugging her knees to her chest for warmth. Did the people without magical robes like mine all freeze to death here? Ash raised both eyebrows and snorted. Was there a plague? Or a war? How many years' worth of graves is that out there? They didn't all die at the same time, did they? She stared at the wolf. What are you doing here, Ash? Finally, the smirk faded from Ash's face. You've not read the Heatland Chronicles, I gather. Nope. I hadn't even heard of it until you told me. No, I suppose you wouldn't have. It's not the kind of book a girl your age goes out of her way to read. Not even sure it's been translated into a language you can read. Ash removed his feet from the table and sat up straight with the rustling of clothes. This country has been an independent country for 1,000 years. The Hateland Chronicle is its history. Yuri nodded for him to go on. As I showed you before on the globe, the Hatelands are so small as to easily covered by one finger. Yet war wages here incessantly. Either countries invade, or we invade them. There have been civil wars here too. We have been entangled in such war for the last 150 years. Do you have a government? We do. There's a royal house, and a parliament beneath made up of nobles and those from the privileged classes. We are in essence a kingdom. But there are several bloodlines within the royal house, and they love to feud amongst themselves. That is what leads to our internal strife. But it's such a small country. Perhaps they fight so viciously because the stakes are so small. Ash leaned forward. If your grip were to extend just far enough, you could seize this entire kingdom for your own. So do men suffer greed and delusions of grandeur. Sky came up from downstairs, carrying a heavy-looking tray in both hands. The tray held a large silver pot and some polished silver cups. Yuri hadn't expected anything fancy. For a moment, all she could do was stare. There's no plastic or vinyl in this world, Ash said with a chuckle at Yuri's surprised expression. I knew that. I guess that's a very beautiful pot. Silver is strong and good against poisons, he explained casually. Good against poisons? There's little point in wasting our time with a lengthy history lecture. Merely touch upon the major points. Don't need to go back the whole 1,000 years. What concerns us most is the last century and a half. Taking a silver cup from the tray, Ash continued. The Civil War that began 150 years ago, continues to this day, is, simply put, a feud between two brothers in the royal house. Half-brothers, to be precise. They never did get along, even as children. When they became adults, they gathered loyal retainers around them, raised armies, and took their struggle to the field of battle. The first round of fighting had gone on for 10 years, left most of the country devastated. Then, fearing that the Hatelands would be utterly destroyed, nobles intervened and compelled the brothers to come to an agreement. Kings would be chosen from both of their lineages, alternating every generation. Yet when it came to their grandchildren's generation, though only 30 years had passed since the accord, both camps began to eye each other with envy. They struggled for rank and territory, found fault with one another and with the terms of the treaty, each trying to claim the right of succession for their bloodline alone. With both sides equally engaged in such foolishness, there's little hope of stopping it. Took another few generations, about 50 years, Ash explained, for their struggles to once again spread to the general populace. When the conflict had been confined within the bounds of the royal city and palace, the Hatelands had gradually recovered its strength. Field once burned grew green, cities were rebuilt, trade with their neighbors had increased. This village of Canal was founded just in the last 50 years. Man did not live in places like this before. The villagers here now are the grandchildren of the original settlers. But, as abundance returned to the land, the struggles of the royal house grew fiercer. The richer the lands one side held, the more eagerly the other side fought to claim them. 57 years ago, in the 9th month of the 877th year of our holy calendar, there was a great upheaval in the capital city. That was the start of the current round of fighting. Ash tapped his chest lightly. The weaver who made me wrote most vividly about those events. That's right, you remembered. This is all a story. Story of war. At the time, the elder son's lineage had just claimed the throne, as decreed by the treaty of 100 years before. The 17th Holy King of the Hatelands, Kadisk III, Incidentally, it was also one of the elder son's lineage who started the war, the new king's cousin, a noble yet impoverished lad by the name of Kirik. Kadisk III was a boy king, only 8 years old. His father, who had been king 2 generations prior, had died of an illness at the age of 30, and his successor, the current king's uncle, died in an accident only 2 years after taking the throne. He had fallen from his horse during a mock battle held to honor the king's birthday. Rumors of assassination surrounded both royal deaths. Tempers flared, and the arguments began to spread outside of the bounds of the palace. At only 8 years of age, the king could do little by himself. He did what his relatives, his steward, and his ministers advised him to do. Once again, turmoil spread through the land. Feudal lords and members of the privileged classes, who thought nothing but fattening their own bellies, began to devour themselves from inside out. Some of the nobles and land gentry had begun dealing with one of the Hateland's neighbors across the long disputed border. Together, they hatched a plan to install a puppet government in exchange for privileged positions in the new regime. You know what we call their kind? Ash asked, smiling crookedly beneath sleepy, half-lidded eyes. Traitors. He looked at Yuri. I'm guessing you've never seen a traitor yourself. They don't have fangs or 2 faces, despite what you may have heard. They look like regular folk. It's the roots that are rotten. Yuri nodded. And his boy Kirik rose up against them? That's right. He started a rebellion. That's right. He started a rebellion. A successful rebellion at that. There had been several sporadic uprisings before Kirik came on the scene. But all had been crushed by royal forces before they could spread, or undid themselves before they could pose a real threat. The royal army has always held the greatest portion of power in the land, Ash went on. There are many in this land who wish to join the army. Why? Can't believe that anyone in the royal house would have so many devoted admirers, but with the history of this place. Ash lifted a long finger. For one, there is a deeply ingrained concept of southern progression. More of a desire than a concept, actually. The people of this land have long wanted to spread to the warmer territories in the south. In order to do that, we must invade another country. And for that, we must have a strong army. As I said, we have fought many wars to expand our borders, though few were successful. Next, he lifted a second finger. The Hatelands are a northern country. We spend more than a third of each year encased in ice. We are thin, with little land worth tilling. It's difficult for us to live off the bounty of the land alone. Hunting and livestock help for certain, but it's not enough. However, the Hatelands were rich under the soil. Iron, copper, gold, silver, and coal could all be found in large amounts. The mines had produced precious gems as well, diamonds and emeralds by the bucket. Trace the family lines back, you'll find most of our nobility were once in the mining business. As the landed nobles struggled with one another for access to the richest veins, the lords and their followers joined in alliances, eventually forming the kingdom as we know it today. Merchants, endowed with the right to trade under the watchful eyes of the nobles, soon gained power, creating another class of the wealthy and privileged. They were joined by the larger landowners, who controlled a large portion of the sparse farmland of the Hatelands. Though the land is poor, we are rich, at least in certain places. There is a great disparity in wealth, which means that those with the gold require military strength to protect their privileged positions. Luckily for them, their coffers are overflowing, and they can well afford to maintain a sizable active army. In the Hatelands, the military also took on the task of preserving order, effectively becoming a kind of well-armed police force. Were I the second son of a poor farmer, my choice would be clear. I would join the army. It is more than just secure employment. To a certain extent, soldiers and keepers of the peace are given authority. Yuri thought about what he meant for a moment. So they go from being poor, overworked, and in danger of arrest to being well fed and the ones doing the arresting. It wasn't about loyalty to the royal house, about choosing sides. Do they want to be counted among the ones with wealth and power, or the ones without? Farmer with a single plot of land will never escape poverty, not in a lifetime. Working the mines earns better pay than farming, but the danger is commiserate. There is no guarantee you'll keep your job either. What about merchants? Are they free to do business as they like? Ash explained that in order to become a merchant, royal decree stipulated that one had to join a merchant guild, for which one needed a considerable amount of collateral and the backing of a merchant already in the guild. Must be a whole lot of bribery going on, Audrey squeaked from Yuri's collar, where he had been pretending to sleep since she came upstairs. Bet it's all over the place. Enough for even a young dictionary who knows the law of the world to sniff out yes, Ash said with a grin. It is as you say, Aju. One cannot simply become a merchant. Some try to become officials of the state, but that requires this. He tapped his head. And the proper lineage. So that's not easy either. Yuri sighed. So it's all about where you're born? Not if you join the army. There, it's possible to get ahead in the world through your deeds. It's not entirely unreasonable to imagine a boy from a nobody family in a nobody village becoming a great soldier, even a general. Thus, a new noble is born. Once systems like these became established, it was hard to overturn them, Ash explained. The young ones who join the army know the poor life of the farmer, and unbearable working conditions that the miner must endure. But once your own lot is steady and secure, it's hard to get all that enthusiastic about changing the way things are. Which was why all the uprisings before Kirik had begun among the disenfranchised, the small-time farmers and mine workers. They rebelled against overtaxation, or stood up in rage when mine cave-ins and pestilence claimed the lives of their friends. The people who rose up were the ones who could sink no lower, and the ones who put them back in their places were the soldiers of the royal army. None of the soldiers take the side of the people? What reason would they have? That ideal to righteous indignation, it's hard to imagine them wanting to lift a finger to help. And even if they did have these things, they wouldn't last 3 days. I spoke plainly. Even in the midst of injustice, if one's own position is not endangered, it is only human to defend the status quo. Well then, Yuri said, shrugging her shoulders, why doesn't everyone just join the army? Leave the mountains in their fields to rot. I get the king and those nobles where it hurts. Yuri, Aji squeaked, patting her cheek with the tip of his long tail. The farmers and miners are tied to the land. It always works like that. They have laws to keep them where they are, under the watchful eye of their lord. They couldn't leave if they wanted to. They don't have the freedom. If they tried to just run away, they'd be punished. I mean, isn't that obvious? Haven't you ever read a history book? Yuri looked at Ash. It appears I left something out of my explanation, he said. You see, in order to join the army or become an official, one needs the permission of the local minister of the land. Aju is correct. The common people are not permitted to move freely. Many youths joined the army, but only when the land could spare them. The system took all excess labor force from localities across the kingdom, absorbing them into the government via the army, Ash explained. What about girls? Can they join the army too? Yuri asked. The thought suddenly occurred to her. Are there any female soldiers? Ash blinked slowly. There are some, mostly from the more prominent military houses, whose ancestors were generals for many generations. What about village girls? They go to the mining towns or the farming towns to become wives and mothers, give birth to the next generation of laborers, all while working themselves, of course. Ash told her. They have no freedom, either. Don't they ever rebel? Ash guffawed, as though he had never heard of such a thing. That would be difficult. In places where there has been a disaster or famine, they can no longer live there. The village girls go to the towns. Ash's smile vanished, and Yuri thought a look of pity came into his eyes. In order to survive, many sell themselves, even girls your age. Without a family or proper papers, there's little hope of finding decent work, even in the larger towns. I get it, Audrey squeaked, switching his tail and climbing on top of Yuri's shoulder. His tail stung a bit where it slapped the back of her neck. I get what kind of place the Hatelands is. Just tell me why you say Kirik's rebellion worked. There's still civil war, isn't there? Ash crossed his legs and grunted at the mouse. I was getting to that. Perhaps I took a little too much time with the preamble. The tea in Yuri's silver cup had gone completely cold. Hey, Aisha. Kirik's rebellion succeeded at first. Ash's eyes dropped to the floorboards beneath his feet. Kadisk III was imprisoned, and his family and those stewards, retainers, and officers who didn't bow to Kirik were apprehended and sentenced. Kirik was made king. He was of the royal bloodline, after all, so he had claim to the throne. That was another thing that set Kirik's rebellion apart from all that had come before. But, Ash added, lifting a finger, here's another problem. The rebellions before had come about at the hands of the common folk, who used nothing but their hoes and mining picks for weapons. Up against a trained, properly armed military, the weapons might as well have been made of wax. They were crushed with ease. Not so Kirik's army. He led neither starving farmers nor angry miners. You mean he had his own army? I thought he was poor, Aju said. No army at first, Ash explained, shaking his head. But he built one. An immortal one. Yuri's eyes went wide. Soldiers that can't die? How's that work? They could not die because they were dead to begin with, Ash told him. Kirik led an army of the walking dead. Hey, Casey, how's it going? He was interrupted by Sky, who had been sitting a short distance away from the window. Someone comes, the devout said. Yuri ran over to him. Getting her footing on the crossbeam, she grabbed the windowsill and lifted herself up so she could see the terrain. Below, a small child wrapped in rags was dashing through the gravestones, occasionally jumping over them, making for the entrance to the hut. Dmitri, she heard him shout. Dmitri, are you home? It's a boy. Just get more cozy. Shh, pretend I'm not here. Too late. I already noticed you. It's a boy. Yuri peered through the window and noticed with a start that the iron-bound gate at the bottom of the hill was still closed, the padlock securely attached. How'd he get inside? Who's Dmitri? Aju asked. Me, Ash replied, went down the stairs. You motherfucker. Sorry. This guy, since they're all just coming in, introduced as the man of ash because his hair is ash colored. We asked him what his name was. He said, I don't really have one. You might as well just call me Ash. And then now we know his name's fucking Dmitri. Yuri quickly followed him as quickly and as quietly as she could. Though she knew the vestment's protection hid her from both sight and sound. The heavy door to the hut opened with a loud slam. Dmitri! The boy's eyes found Ash immediately, and a smile spread across his face. Then he shot across the room like a cannonball. So glad you're back. The boy jumped and Ash, or Dmitri rather, caught him in mid-air with practiced ease. Why didn't you tell me you were back? The boy hung onto Ash's neck with one arm, playfully hit Ash's shoulder with a tightly clenched fist. I've only just returned, Ash explained, gentle curve to his sleepy eyes. How did you know? The smoke from your chimney, the boy said with a triumphant chortle. Then he sprang away from Ash as lightly as he had jumped to him. It was like watching a tiny acrobat at work. He didn't just leap down. He did a backflip before landing on the floor. Yuri stared at him. Who is this boy? You from a circus? You bring me a present? The boy asked as he jumped across the room, like an organ grinder's monkey snooping for hidden treasures. I see you're as energetic as ever, Utsu, Ash said, taking a seat at the crude wooden table. How's your mother doing? For the first time since she had spotted him through the window, the acrobatic boy stopped. From this close, she could see that his clothes were a little more ragged. Sorry, my reading comprehension apparently has gone downward. From this close, she could see that his clothes were little more than ragged strips of cloth wrapped tightly around him. Loose threads hung from the hem like spaghetti. At the wolf's question, a cloud came over the boy's small face. The boy's eyes were sharp, but his cheeks were pale. His body was thin, almost emaciated. Yuri wondered how old he was. Maybe 7 or 8? Not so good. She's been getting fever at night. I see. She's taking the medicine he gave me, though, Dimitri. Perhaps I should adjust the formula. Give you a new batch soon. You have to wait for your present until then. I haven't even begun to unpack. I'll help you. Now you know that won't do. If they find you here, the village elders won't be pleased. Utsu stuck out his lower lip in a pout. It seemed that even in a region as different from Yuri's as this, kids were the same. I don't care. The elder doesn't scare me. Rules are rules, child. If you want to break them, at least have the wit not to flout them openly. Utsu frowned, his arms drooping to his sides. The sleeves of his ragged robe swept the floor. Fine. I'll be waiting at home, then. That's a good boy. Come soon, right? My mama will be waiting. Ash assured the boy he understood, guiding him back to the door. Ash opened the door and called after him. Be careful, all right? Me? I'll be fine, the boy shouted, dashing out at breakneck speed. Yuri watched him leave, jumping over gravestones and swerving between them like a slalom racer. 2 mysteries were solved. 1. Why Ash had told the boy to be careful. 2. How Utsu had been able to get over the fence. It was simple, really. He had jumped it. On the way out, he did a forward flip over the high iron bars, waving back to Ash as he landed on the far side. That kid human? Aju asked, standing up on his hind legs. He was clearly impressed. He's human, Ash replied, shutting the door firmly. Though he has Springfoot. It's a kind of, he paused, searching for the right word. It's a kind of disease. Disease that makes you stronger? I didn't know there was such a thing. Yuri's eyes. The boy had looked like a star athlete. How could that be an illness? You saw how he runs? Yes. His legs are amazingly strong. Indeed, but he cannot run in a straight line. Now that he said it, she realized it was true. There was a proper path from the gate up to the little shack, but the boy hadn't used it at all. Choosing, she'd thought, instead to weave through the gravestones. Spring feet have superhuman strength in their legs, but they can't control it. That's why they can't sit still, not even for a moment. His legs keep moving of their own accord. The boy couldn't go to school nor work in the fields, Ash explained. Are all the people in the village like that? No, Ash replied, indicating the stairs with a jerk of his head. Let us continue our previous discussion while I brew the medicine for Utsu's mother. What I was telling you about is related to this, after a fashion. Unbelievably, it looked like he intended to make the medicine on that incredibly cluttered table of the high school chemistry set. Ash opened a small drawer next to the table, began to pull out what looked like roots of plants, leaves, and the sand-like powder he kept in a small flask. Then he sat and began to work. Kirik raised the dead and made soldiers of them. He handed an empty flask to Sky, asking him to fill it with water. With a small knife, the size of Yuri's pinky, Ash began cutting the roots. In a poor country ravaged by war, the one thing in abundance is the dead. If you could raise them and make them your own, you'd have a very powerful army on your side. Yeah, but can you raise the dead? Ash stopped in mid-cut, glanced at Yuri. His expression told her everything she needed to know. You can. You can, she whispered. Suddenly her throat felt dry. Did he use the Book of Elam? Very good, Ash grunted. Wait, just a second. Yuri began dashing around the cluttered room like the boy had below. She found she couldn't sit still. I've heard something like this before. Mr. Minochi's reading room from the sage. The sage in green told me. He said that Mr. Minochi collected all those books because he was trying to find a way to raise someone from the dead. Ash nodded slowly. But the sage in green said that was impossible. He said he tried to convince Mr. Minochi of that over and over, and he never listened. Why would he? Minochi had the Book of Elam, after all. You mean Mr. Minochi did it? Succeeded in raising someone? No, he did not. Huh? Why not? Yuri stomped across the room, shaking her fists in the air. If Kira could do it, why couldn't he? None of this is making any sense. Aju squeaked. Yuri, sit. But Aju, just sit down. Frowning, Yuri found a spot on the floor. The mouse leaned over from her shoulder, gave her a whack on the nose with his tiny paw. The Allcast has to keep her cool at all times, Yuri. Sorry, I just got excited. Ash lit a small alcohol burner on the table, placed a beaker full of water on the stand above it. The stand's legs were long and wobbly. The whole apparatus looked dangerously unstable. Sky returned with the water and stood by the table, ready for his next task. Let me tell you of how the Book of Elam was created, Ash continued once they were quiet. It began as a history, chronicle of the great deeds of one hero. You could call it a legend. The hero's name was Altius. They called him King Altius the Victor. He had led the armies of the Hatelands 500 years ago, triumphantly repelling an invasion by one of the Hateland's more powerful neighbors. At the time, war raged all over the continent, not just up here. It was the same everywhere you went. One country would invade another, absorb its armies, then launch another invasion. Kings rose victorious only to fall a week later, and maps that attempted to draw political boundaries were rendered useless in the span of a year. It was an age of continental warfare. Surrounded by enemies, and small as the Hatelands were, invasion followed upon invasion. As soon as they drove off one would-be conqueror, another would take its place, leaving them barely enough time to catch their breath before they'd be strapping on their armor again. You would run out of soldiers at that rate, Aji observed. Small countries have small populations. True enough, Ash said, nodding, which is why King Altius decided he needed something stronger, powerful, forbidden magic. Magic to raise his fallen soldiers and create an immortal army. Magic, Yuri whispered. Of course it was possible here. The Hatelands were in a story, after all, an imaginary world. Magic could be anywhere, as long as the Weaver who had created the Hatelands wrote about it. Anything was possible. Thanks to this magic, the Hatelands fought on successfully throughout the duration of the Continental War, maintaining their independence. Stories of a forbidden magic, with the power to raise the dead, have been told in legend since the Hatelands first came together as a country, Ash told them. But even back 500 years, knowledge of this magic was fragmented at best, and it had been much embellished with legend, making it useless as it was. It was a military mage in the service of the king, who performed experiment after experiment, refining the magic until it worked. The mage's name was Elam, a woman, incidentally, Ash added, much to Yuri's surprise. A female mage? That's right. I recall you were asking about girls who made a difference. Well, she was one. That's not quite how I meant it, Yuri thought glumly. The power to raise the dead seemed frightful. Though it had saved Elam's country, Yuri wasn't sure that made it right. It's ironic, Ash muttered. Only a woman can truly create life. Perhaps it requires a woman to raise the dead as well. After the victory, Both King Altius and the mage Elam were revered by the people, but Elam did not consider it an honor in the least. She left the palace. For the Hatelands enjoyed prosperity such as it had never known before. After its victory, it was far better off than most of the other countries on the war-weary continent. Elam chose to find an abandoned corner of the country and there live in solitude. Why? Yuri asked, though she expected the answer was forthcoming. Because she understood. She knew why the magic to raise the dead had been forbidden. When she first completed the spell, she went to the king and told him it would only invite more conflict. The magic would create an invincible army, but not one that would benefit the people. She asked if the king still approved, and King Altius did. What troubles you, Elam? He asked of his mage. Is it not to defend our land that we drive back the invaders at our gates? How does this not benefit our people? With Elam's magic, it was possible to completely revive someone who had died. This wasn't hedge magic, like animating zombies. It was a full person returned to the living, soul intact. But didn't that make people happy? Yuri asked. I would think they'd be overjoyed to have their sons and husbands returned from the dead, and to know they would never lose them again. Continental wars ended, Ash continued in a low voice, ignoring her question. The liquid in the beaker he had placed over the burner had begun to boil. Yuri watched as the liquid turned to deep red. In the end, the Hatelands boasted an army of immortal soldiers, 12,000 strong. They would never die. They would never fall. They were perfect warriors. In a world of peace, there was nothing for them to do. Ash adjusted the flame. Some put their sturdy bodies to good use, working the mines and the fields. Most of them had begun there before becoming soldiers. They simply returned to their roots, so to speak. But many were career soldiers. They'd grown up used to military life, being treated like heroes. They did not want to dirty their hands in the soil again. They could not go back to their regular lives. Ash gave Yuri a long look. Think about it, he said at length. You're immortal. You cannot die. What do you do? What do you become? You wouldn't fear danger. You wouldn't fear anyone. I think there wouldn't be much that could stop them from doing whatever they wanted. Ash bowed his head, his face grave. Not a decade passed since the end of the Continental Wars, when the Hatelands devolved into a nest of bandits and murderers. They had won the war, and it ruined them, just as the mage Elam had warned. Still, for the space of 7 years, the victor King Altius struggled to maintain peace. He knew there would be more fighting on the continent before long. The Hatelands needed their immortal army. Yet there was a limit, and it came quickly. While they drew breath, people changed. Those women who rejoiced at seeing their sons and lovers return to life watched them turn to something inhuman before their eyes. Creatures of magic, made to do an insufferable amount of work, and they could not stand it. In desperation, King Altius sent scouts across the Hatelands in search for Elam's whereabouts. But she came to the palace of her own accord. What must I do to undo the spell? The king asked. She answered, You must end my life. For you see, the arcane magic Elam had used was tied to its creator's life. Were she to die, the men she had raised would in that very moment turn to ash. So it was that Elam had been sentenced to death by hanging in the palace courtyard. The immortal soldiers turned to ash, as she said they would. The ash rose into the air, becoming a dark cloud that, as it was said, blotted out the sun over the Hatelands for 10 full days. Soon after, every book wherein had been written Elam's magic, and the history of her immortal army, and the many victories of King Altius, were torn to shreds and burned. What? Aji shouted, leaping up from his hind legs. The Book of Elam was lost? The original was, yes, Ash explained. But there was another mage who had secretly copied parts of Elam's work, preserving them in the scroll. The scroll had been lost to the depths of the history, until it reappeared suddenly, 57 years ago, in the hands of an impoverished noble of rich lineage. named Kirik. Kirik had taken up arms to save his countrymen from the suffering he saw around him. He was no fool. His aims were noble, his eyes clear, and his heart burned with righteous indignation. That is why he did not seek to duplicate Elm's magic in whole. He went to a teacher of his who was knowledgeable in the ways of sorcery. Turned out that in Kirik's lineage, on his mother's side, there had been many royal mages. Magic ran in his blood. Kirik was able to fill the gaps in the imperfect copy of Elm's spell. Thinking that the problem had arisen when men had been restored to their former humanity, only requiring soldiers in any case, he sought not to return men to the world of the living, but to create fighting machines to do his bidding. He would simply raise their bodies, leave their hearts to rot. The soldiers would not think or desire anything for themselves. They would exist to follow orders and hunt their prey, like well-trained hounds to attack Kirik's enemies. When his rebellion was over, all he would need do would be round them up and dispatch them. It's horrible, Yuri whispered. And foolish, Ash declared, placing his boiling red liquid in the decanter. He didn't stop to think why. 500 years before him, Elm had raised men whole, souls intact. He had a reason to do so, you see. Dead men forced to walk again, without a soul, were mere cases of flesh, with gaping holes where their hearts belonged, and into those holes darkness crept. Spirits of the earth, the destructive forces that fly unseen through the air, and the evil thoughts of the living began to accumulate within Kirik's undead. He had led them in rebellion for his people, and the cheers of those he freed from oppression were many. Yet, even as victories mounted, his army was slowly corrupted. Kirik's rebellion ended quickly. He was made king. Peace was restored to Hatelands. The governance for the people was about to begin, but the darkness quickly filled the shells of the men he had raised, and it changed them from inside, making them something other than men. Having no other recourse, Kirik forced his undead soldiers into a great dungeon beneath the royal palace, there to remain until he was ready to dispose of them for good. But then creatures fell, and a horde began to appear from that dungeon. The guards were their first victims, you see. Ash added, his expression cold. These creatures ate human flesh. They were cannibals of a sort, because they had just begun their afterlives as men. Ew, Audrey groaned, for Yuri had even finished processing what she was hearing. With great urgency, Kirik assembled the royal mages and led them against the very creatures he had created, beneath the halls of his own home. His version of Elm's magic should have enabled him to turn his raised army back into corpses, but the darkness inside them had taken the shape of souls, giving them a new life, and his magic did nothing. The fiends broke from their dungeon prisons, ransacked the palace, and spilled out into the capital and countryside beyond. Ash closed his eyes, either recollecting the scene of mayhem, trying to keep an imagined scene from escaping his head. Among the survivors of the royal house that Kirik had destroyed were those who sought to use this opportunity to defeat him. Instead of attempting to quell the new threat, they worked more magic on the fiends to bend them to their own will. But that had only made matters worse. The conflicting magic cast upon these creatures made them huge and violent, transforming them in unpredictable ways. Of all the resulting monstrosities, the worst were those that developed the ability to reproduce. You mean the creatures had children? Not like that. There were some that, if you cut off their arm, another whole creature would grow from the severed limb. Cut off their head, another creature would grow from that. Yuri, Aju, and Sky were all speechless. It made Yuri sick to her stomach just imagining it. Chill ran down her spine, not on account of the cold wind blowing in through the cracks in the walls. Were they able to drive them back? Aju asked. hoping beyond all hope for a happy ending to the story. Ash nodded. Yes, but it took much effort. They had to kill them one at a time. How did they do it? Most of them they burned. It's no pleasant task, I assure you. In the ensuing fight against the creatures, Kirik lost his life. He had been on the throne for only 60 days. Some historians call him the King of 2 months. Something about the way Ash talked of these events tugged at Yuri's mind. So there you have it, Ash said, his voice hoarse from the telling. All of these events are written in the Book of Elam, which showed up in the years afterwards. There are some who call the book Chronicles of Kirik, but only those who stayed with him throughout the chaos. Few use that name now. And that book was sitting in Winochi's reading room, Hachi whispered, gnashing his teeth. Not the original. That was a copy of a copy of a copy. Books deteriorate over time. If only their contents deteriorated as well. Ash had finished brewing his medicine. He stood, taking a vial small enough to fit in the palm of his hand out of the drawer by the table, along with a piece of white paper that had been cut into a square. Ash, she said. Were you there? Ash stopped what he was doing. The weaver who wrote about Kirik's War too. Where did you fit in the story? Ash smiled then, much to Yuri's surprise. You remembered about the weaver. Yuri felt her palm begin to sweat. Couldn't help but get the feeling that you knew Kirik when you talked about him. His smile widened. You have good instincts. Next to them, Sky gasped, startled. Kirik's family was poor, but being nobles, they had territory. There was nothing much. A cold village deep in the mountains called Denai. Kirik's father had been a caring lord to his people, rare for the time. He had even waived taxes in years when crops fell short, no doubt contributing to his family's relative poverty. Kirik had been an only son, and his mother had died soon after giving birth to him. He was raised by a nursemaid. The nursemaid had a child of her own, newly born. That child was me. A distant look came into Ash's eyes. We studied the ways of magic together. In those days, an old hermit lived in Denai village, who had once been chief among the palace mages. His name was Master Bran. He had been a powerful mage in his day, extremely powerful. We had grown weary of palace politics and infighting. Thanks to him, Kirik and I were able to learn much magic from an early age, even things they did not teach in the Royal Academy. It was Master Bran who had helped Kirik find the scroll that contained the partial Book of Elam, and it was he who helped him complete his own version in later years. When Kirik began his rebellion, I intended to go with him, but he asked me instead to stay in Denai. He wanted me to look after the village and Master Bran. You will surely need your protection should my rebellion fail. Throughout the struggle, I never had cause to go to the capital. It was not long between the time when the rebellion ended in success and the fiends reached the mountains of my village. By the time they managed to drive off the creatures, the village had lost more than half of its population. Word of Kirik's death came soon after. Master Bran took his own life. I think he planned on doing that from the start. He had made a special poison for the occasion. Master Bran had left Ash with his knowledge, including knowledge of the Nameless Land and of the King in Yellow. It wasn't Kirik who had been poisoned by the King in Yellow. It was Master Bran. He thought that by lending his power to that clear-eyed lad, he could bring eternal peace to the Hatelands, fortune to its people. Master Bran's heart wished this, and it called out to the hero, which brings us to now. Ash spread his hands, as if to show he had given all he had to offer. Silence fell on the room. Yuri didn't know what to say next. Aji was curled up in a ball on the floor. What of the graves? It was Sky's voice that broke the silence. What of all the graves surrounding this house, and the child Utsu's extraordinary strength and agility? You said these things were related to your tale. Yuri turned her eyes to Ash. So I did, Nameless Devout, Ash said. His, his gaze was cold, and here I thought your head was empty. Would you quit talking to him like that? Yuri interrupted. This guy is my servant, but he is also my friend. Ash turned away, looking out through the clouded window. Remember what I said about the creatures eating humans? It would always start with the head, not stop until every last bit was consumed. But sometimes, rarely, a person so attacked would be saved with only injuries. These people, the survivors, developed strange abilities in the following months and years. They grew incredibly strong. They could see in the middle of the night as though it were day. Their hearing improved to the point that they could hear someone talking on the other side of a mountain. The venom of the creatures flowed into their bodies, and in time it changed them. And they all became supermen? Yuri asked hopefully. That doesn't sound bad at all. Ash shook his head. It didn't last long. Those affected would die in 2 or 3 years after their powers manifested themselves. Oh, that does sound bad. Most sane people avoided touching the bodies of the affected. They didn't want to burn them either, because that would be treating them no better than they had treated the creatures. It is our custom here in the Hatelands to bury our dead whole. Gradually, business started up of collecting the corpses. That was my work here. Dimitri the Undertaker, they call me. This all happened 57 years ago, didn't it? How could those people still be around if the transformation killed them? They are still among us. You saw Utsu yourself. Utsu's great-grandfather had been bitten as a young boy, but his powers did not manifest for years. He took a wife and had children. These children grew, married, had children of their own, and all of them were affected. So, Yuri began in a timid voice, it's hereditary? Yes. That's why it does not end. If those who manifested their powers were dwindling in number by the year, it was rare for children as young as Utsu to manifest powers so early. Most only learned they were affected by the time they were grown with children of their own. I believe the creature's venom is acting to preserve itself. It keeps replicating itself down through the bloodline. It makes it sound like the venom has a will of its own. Utsu is shunned here in Kanal. Other villagers fear him. He lives with his mother in a small shack outside the village. So you're his only friend then? She expected him to brush the comment off. What he said surprised everyone. Dimitri has no friends save Utsu. There's silence again. Aju hopped off of Yuri's shoulder, snuck down through her robes up to the other side of her head, and stuck his nose in her ear. Hey Yuri, he whispered. You know, I've been thinking. Maybe this Ash guy isn't so bad after all. Yuri put a hand over her mouth and smiled. Ash was too busy putting medicine in the pouch he had fashioned from the small square of paper to notice. Yuri smiled at Sky, then froze. Sky was standing stiff as a board, a dark look on his face. Yuri wondered if what Ash had said before about his head being empty had offended him. Or maybe he's frozen solid. It is still terribly cold in the room. We leave for the capital tomorrow, Ash said, his fingers busily working. Rest well tonight. It'll be a hard road. Why don't we just jump there? Ajay suggested, pointing to the glyph on the floor. Yuri cannot take us all there by her power alone. I have business along the way. Besides, Yuri thought to ask him, but decided he probably wouldn't tell her anyway. And I have business along the way besides. Yuri thought to ask him, but decided he probably wouldn't tell her anyway. She was tired, besides, and wanted to rest. Okay, she said, and that was that. That's chapter 9. Let me see how long chapter 10 is. Yeah, no, chapter 10 we're gonna save for next stream. So that's where I'm gonna end it today. And I think I'm just gonna regularly end it instead of rating anyone. Uh, because I am tired. I appreciate y'all coming out, and I will see y'all on Friday